Tom Blanton of the National Security Archive. Judge Gerhard Gesell made it official today. No jail time for Oliver North. Your reaction?
I think a lot of people were surprised. I know this morning one of North's major backers, Rob Owen, who had been his courier to the Contras, had predicted before the sentence was handed down that this was a hanging judge and surely there'd be jail time. But when you look at Gesell's actual order, it seems that he followed almost directly the conclusion of his jury. And that was to say, Oliver North, you were really the subject. You were manipulated. You were the subordinate within a larger complex scheme with some cynical superiors. Fascinating language he used. And that you're not really, you shouldn't have to pay the price. Partial price. I mean, there's 1,200 hours of community service. That's a serious commitment. That's 30 work weeks. $150,000 even for Oliver North, who can make a speech and raise $25,000 a night. That's a significant amount of money. I think it did surprise a lot of people, including North's very strong supporters. But on the other hand, it's pretty consistent with the jury verdict.
Sam Dickens, you're with the American Security Council Foundation. Your reaction?
Well, I don't really feel that I had any surprise at all. When you think that the jury found him guilty of the things that he confessed before the jury and nothing else, there had to be a significant sentence. I think that the judge really had to take into his own sentencing the facts that he knew and also the involvement of others. And I think that Judge Gesell, in talking about he made a comment about some cynicism of the leadership above Oliver North, reflects that. So in sentencing, he was taking all those things into consideration, not just that he was guilty of those elements.
Was it a fair sentence?
I think it is. One could nitpick, one can say $150,000, that's a lot of money. Maybe the judge took into consideration that he can raise that money fairly easily. Aid to people working all these hours, I would hope that it would be in support of refugees of Nicaragua and the Nicaraguan resistance. That's how we got into this mess, isn't it? Because of the Congress. I think that Oliver North would be delighted to go to Miami and other places and help the not the illegals, but the immigrants that have been forced out of Nicaragua, and potentially the combatants that we're no longer apparently willing to support. And many of them will be streaming into Miami and those regions, and Oliver North would probably be delighted to help them.
Although I think he's going to be here in D.C. working with drug offenders. I mean, that was the actual designation of the sentence, which would be that many hours working with drug offenders here in D.C., being in a sense a soldier in William Bennett's war on drugs. Pretty interesting sentence, and it's also an indication of what Gesell thinks is a major crisis.
Yes, but maybe some people really don't understand that Oliver North was really working against drugs. I mean, that's one of the things that the people don't seem to realize, the nexus between Nicaragua and the Sandinistas and Fidel Castro in Cuba, despite all these attacks on Ochoa. Fidel Castro has been deeply involved in drug trafficking, and now Noriega is. So all these things are interrelated, and Oliver North was working very much against drugs before, and it looks like he will be now.
Let me interrupt to introduce our guests to our viewers this evening. We're going to be talking about the sentencing of Oliver North, and we invite your questions and your comments for our two guests. First, let me introduce you to Tom Blanton. You heard from first on our program. He is with the National Security Archive as Deputy Director. What is that organization?
We're a library of declassified government documents. Essentially what we're trying to do is pull together all the materials that the government has ever released on national security foreign policy issues and apply some of the latest technologies, computerization, some of the basic principles of library science, try to make them really accessible, really for the first time. Most of these kinds of documents have been lingering in the basements of people like Sam Dickens and myself for years and years, never accessible to anybody else who wanted to study them, who wanted to draw the opposite conclusion that Sam or I might draw. So our goal in life is to be open to the public, is to try to provide that kind of basic service and educate, enrich the policy debate, provide more access to documents that are really essential to this kind of study and this kind of argument and discussion.
Does the organization have a political point of view?
Nonpartisan, nonprofit, located at the Brookings Institution, funded by a lot of different foundations who also sponsor research on foreign policy. Our basic goal in life is to talk about documents, to get them out into the public debate, to try to get away from a lot of the anonymous source kind of Washington press that often occurs and that we're all familiar with. And try to get back, it's not so much that the documents themselves are truth, but they're at least fixed in time, and you can use them if you base your arguments on those, if you base your research on those. I think we'll all be better off.
Sam Dickens is with the American Security Council Foundation as Director of Inter-American Affairs. What's the foundation all about?
Well, we've been in the business for some 35 years under the leadership of John Fisher, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer. And the focus is on national security issues from a bipartisan support area. You can't have a national security policy of this country without having bipartisanship. So the focus has always been on that, gaining support for critical issues in foreign policy and defense, and getting bipartisan support and going forward. So it's identifying critical issues, gaining support within the Congress for those issues, and then trying to get the legislation through. And the foundation aspect, which I'm with, is purely educational.
Did today's sentencing of Oliver North definitively close any chapters in the Iran-Contra story?
It really didn't, because there are a series of other trials that are happening. And in a sense, Gassell's basic order that North was manipulated, subordinate of cynical superiors, points directly toward a trial that will supposedly start by the end of this year of Admiral John Poindexter, former National Security Advisor to the President. In many ways, that trial may be more earth-shaking, or it may be less earth-shaking. The main thing that happened in the North trial was whole batches of new information came out because Gassell essentially forced the government to release previously classified materials that shed some new light that the congressional committees had only gotten part of, or gotten a short ray of sunshine in a few of these arrangements. You have the CIA agent, Joe Fernandez. His trial is this summer over in the Northern District of Virginia. You've got, following him, Secord and Hakeem, who are on trial for some of these other issues, including, in Secord's case, a series of counts of perjury before Congress in his congressional testimony. He wasn't immunized. He was the first witness, I think, as we all remember. And then you have John Poindexter. If John Poindexter pulls the same defense that Oliver North did, which is, I was carrying out the orders of my superiors, as opposed to what he said to the congressional committees, the buck stops with me. If Poindexter goes with it was my superiors, there are only a couple of superiors to John Poindexter, and that's the former president and the current president. And if he does that, that trial could be quite a lot of fireworks. On the other hand, if he could take a plea bargain, given that North was convicted. So I think the saga actually continues in many ways. However, there are all kinds of different ways these different trials could work out, but it's going to be on the front pages, I think, for the rest of this year and on into 19.
I'd like to see a little bit more happen from an educational standpoint, and I don't think it has been done sufficiently. For example, the National Security Council staff is the arm of the President. When they speak, they're speaking for the President. I think it was a mistake, for example, for Oliver North and Poindexter to go over to Congress. The one to go over to Congress is the President of the United States and the separation of powers. And they are not members of the State Department. They're not members of the Defense Department or the FBI. They are his personal staff. And when they speak, they're speaking for the President. And I don't think enough attention has been paid to that aspect of it. So when the Congress was going after Poindexter and Oliver North, they were really going after the President. They wanted to weaken President Reagan, and they were trying, with the Bolin Amendment, to usurp the powers of the President. I'd like to see more in that educational aspect to come out. I'm very disappointed that the Reagan administration did not challenge the Bolin Amendment as really being unconstitutional from the separation of powers. They didn't, but I also feel very clearly that the National Security Council was exempt from the Bolin Amendment. No, I know that that's disputed. I'm talking about the way I look at the Constitution and the separation of powers, that the National Security Council was not an intelligence gathering organization. Very clearly. I mean, all the years that I've spent in government, I've never thought, and I don't know anyone who ever thought that the NSC had anything to do with an intelligence gathering. And the Bolin Amendment clearly was narrowed and written that way. If Bolin had wanted to write it another way, to embrace everyone in government, it would have been very easy to do in about one sentence. And he didn't do it. But that's the President's fault. Why he didn't do it, why he didn't challenge, I'm disappointed. Because I think that Oliver North was really doing what he was generally directed to do. This bit of President Reagan saying, I want you to keep body and soul, body and limb together of the Nicaraguan resistance. When you have a job like that to do, and you're a military man, whether you're Admiral Poindexter or you're Colonel North, you're going to do all that's possible to gain the success. And I think they had a very, very much an understanding of the stakes in Central America, what they mean to the United States. And if any of these people that were opposed to what President Reagan wanted to do in Nicaragua with the Nicaraguan resistance looked at the situation today, looked at Panama, looked at Cuba, looked at what's going on in El Salvador with increased arms, they'd know that we have failed miserably. And why did we fail? It was the Congress that failed us.
Step back to one thing that Mr. Dickens said just in terms of the intent of Congress, because I think if you listen to Senator Inouye, who's made at least one speech that I know of on this subject, they deliberately cut short the Iran-Contra investigation for fear of weakening the president. And I think in his speech he said, we determined that if the President Reagan knew about the diversion of funds to the Contras, then he was impeachable, and we'd move right away to an impeachment resolution. If he didn't know about the diversion of funds to the Contras, then he wasn't impeachable, and by dragging on the investigation and going into all these corners, that a lot of which came out in the North trial, we would simply weaken the presidency, give Gorbachev more freedom to move, and therefore we cut it off. We set a deadline.
Well,
I'm going to interrupt, sir, because this is the call-in program, and we're already 15 minutes into it. I'd like to get the callers involved at this point. And we have our lines just about all lighted up right now. We're going to go to the calls, and if you do get a ringing sound, stay with our line, and we'll get to you just as quickly as we can in the 30 minutes we have left. Let's go first to Carson, California. You're on the air.
Hello. I'd just like to say I really don't think that Oliver North got what he deserved. He should have gotten some time. And as far as him going into the community, working with these kids, with the drug thing, these kids already feel as if you have enough money, you can buy your way out of anything. And they equate Contra and Iran with drug smuggling. So I don't think that's sending a very positive message to them. I'll hang up and listen.
All right, thank you.
Well, first, I think you have to realize who Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North is. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He has a very distinguished, heroic combat record in Vietnam. He has suffered terribly. Here he felt, he believed, one could argue about whether everything that he did was absolutely proper, everything correct. One might even question some elements of his judgment. But no one could question what he was trying to accomplish and why he was trying to do it. For his president, and he's working in the National Security Council, and he's trying to support something that he realizes of critical interest in our own national security. That's why I think that he has suffered tremendously, if you know Oliver North, from what has happened to him. His family has suffered tremendously. No, from that aspect, I don't think at all that he should be serving a sentence.
I think he'd do a great job in the inner city. He's a true believer. He's a great proselytizer, as you could tell from his appearance on national television. He can make people believe him. I think he's a leader, a very effective leader, very charismatic. I think in those senses he could be very effective in the inner city. Be a pretty interesting assignment. We'll see how it turns out.
Reaction to the sentencing of Oliver North. We go next to Ann Arbor, Michigan. You're on the air.
I am? All right. Okay, I have a comment and a question. My comment is this. To understand what has been happening in Nicaragua, there is a vital piece missing from the puzzle. This piece that I'm referring to, are American organizations that have been working with the Sandinistas and other Central American revolutionary groups on their behalf. Now, gentlemen, what about groups such as Witness for Peace, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, the Nicaragua Network, etc., etc.? What about these groups? What is their influence? And what about the fact, that a lot of prominent Democrats have been working with these groups? I mean, literally, the Democratic Party is sitting on a time bomb, a powder keg. And I am kind of surprised that the Republicans do not seize on this and just go for the jugular. I mean, what happened with Jim Wright and the SNL scandal is nothing compared to this.
All right, thank you, sir, very much. Appreciate the question. Response?
Go ahead.
Fine. You know, I am torn the same way, being a military man and having spent a year in Vietnam as an operations and a squadron commander, and close air supports to our own forces and the South Vietnamese forces. How you conduct the support of an ally and friends, our allies by the Rio Treaty in Central America, and I'm talking about the Salvadorans, and you talk about supporting the Nicaraguan resistance, fighting clearly a self-identified group as communists and what they're doing. I'm really torn that this country could allow all these different groups under our freedoms, really, to be supporting a communist government. It has really bothered me. And, of course, we have to come back to the executive. It's because of the way the executive department handled it. One could say one needs to declare war, which is the responsibility of Congress. But historically, in conducting these sorts of efforts, we haven't, since World War II, declared war against anyone, but we've been deeply involved in fighting communism. I think more could have been done to prevent these sorts of actions and groups supporting Nicaragua. For example, I wouldn't have allowed us to have diplomatic relations with Nicaragua. I think they should have been cut, and that would have prevented these groups from going into Nicaragua and supporting them.
And on the question of diplomatic relations, and one of the more interesting things that just happened with Afghanistan, when we cut off the relationship, the diplomatic relations in Afghanistan, I think we suffered some dearth of intelligence reporting coming back from what was happening inside the regime. It may be, and I think some intelligence analysts have made the suggestion that by closing our embassy, we actually shot ourselves in the foot, because we then underestimated the staying power of the regime. Whereas if we'd have the embassy there, it serves other purposes, from that perspective. And then beyond that, I think, the story of groups' involvement in Central America, I think there have been a wide range of those on all sides of the issue from all different perspectives.
But there shouldn't be.
But there shouldn't be.
No, there shouldn't be. Because
why not?
The Rio Treaty has stated that we would be opposed to communism. Communism exported by aggression, subversion, or terrorism. So why are we allowing all this to happen? Why aren't we invoking the Rio Treaty? Why aren't we responding to that? President Ascona invoked the Rio Treaty when he asked for the 82nd Airborne, the 9th Infantry Division, to go into Honduras. Oscar Arias, president of Costa Rica, said when he's asked about what would you do if you'd be invaded, he said, well, I'd invoke the Rio Treaty. Why aren't we talking about the Salvadorans as our allies?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, one of the most interesting things that happened in the Salvadoran elections that I'm aware of was a national television appearance with Alfredo Cristiani, who's now the president, who was the candidate of what was seen as the very right-wing conservative party, and a joint appearance with a fellow named Ruben Zamora, who was the Secretary General of the left-wing, what's the Democratic
Communist.
Convergence, that's allied with the guerrilla movement. Yet they were on television together, both denouncing U.S. intervention in their country from both sides of it, that there was too much U.S. control. It's interesting.
That's your analysis.
Interesting.
That's your analysis.
They said it. I
Let me
didn't.
jump in again. We go to Clearwater, Florida. You're on the air.
Clearwater's on the air?
Go
Thank you. I've been very upset by this whole long ordeal and the continuing huge costs to Colonel North. I resent the fact that very few people even refer to him by his title, which he earned very hard. I was a Navy wife for 20 years of a flyer, a pilot. We had a squadron, and he was a SEAL. I mean, I know what it's like to be a service wife, and I know what it's like to be afraid. This is a very brave man, and I think he's been badly treated by former President Reagan. I find it very difficult to ever forgive him for not pardoning Colonel North, because I don't think whatever he did was wrong. Whatever he did, he always had his heart in the right place. And the Congress is so full of pro-communist apologists that it's frightening to me. Nobody ever talks about the fact that before Noriega there was the Torrijos, and Carter was very friendly with him, and it was well known that he was a drug dealer. And Carter knew it, and he kept it hushed up. I mean, I take a monthly publication that gives me this information, and they wouldn't publish it if it weren't true, because it's free to, for anybody to read. Also, whatever he did was nothing compared to what James Wright did, all the illegal shenanigans he did, and he went home with a huge war chest and a fantastic pension and with no criminal activity, and he's never going to be prosecuted. And I think this is wrong. I just don't understand my country with the way they act and the way they treat their veterans.
All right, thanks very much. Tom Blanton.
I think it's an interesting point, because in terms of Ronald Reagan's responsibility to Colonel North, because Colonel North essentially said he was following orders of Ronald Reagan, essentially, and that therefore all these illegalities that were alleged were essentially the problem of his superiors. If you're going to be the fall guy, if you're going to be the subordinate taking orders, Ollie North essentially sat in the courtroom and pointed his finger up at his superiors, Ronald Reagan being at the top of that pyramid. It's fascinating just in terms of the sentence to compare back to some of the Watergate trials, where jail sentences were very common. But one must remember where those started. Those started when Judge Sirica was trying to get a couple of the Watergate burglars to talk. And he threatened them with jail terms, and he put them in jail to make them talk. And it was communications from the jail that McCord finally started talking about the whole apparatus that set up Watergate. In this case, it wasn't a problem with people not talking. In fact, Oliver North at his trial talked at length about how his superiors had ordered this, and in fact introduced into evidence this mammoth stipulation, 42 pages of event after event after event, participated in by President Reagan and Vice President Bush and Secretary Shultz and Secretary Weinberger and Director Casey and the whole range of top national security officials, basically saying, look, it wasn't just me, it wasn't just little Lieutenant Colonel North, it was all these folks. Don't hold me to account for this.
Well, I think loyalty is a two-way street. And I don't believe that Oliver North expected to be a fall guy where there'd be no support up the line for him. I feel very strongly that President Bush at this time now, should pardon Oliver North. One could argue the need to go through a trial. You can say the pros and cons, go through it, go through a conviction, go through sentencing. That has been done. Now is the time to pardon Oliver North. Here his retirement pay has been taken away once he was found guilty. Now he has these other charges hanging over his head. And where is the responsibility then as far as the Speaker of the House is concerned? Why wasn't the Logan Act, for example, brought into play? No one but the executive are allowed to conduct foreign policy. And you look at the Dear Comandante letter that the Democrats signed to the Sandinistas, and the way they really undercut the president and conducted their own foreign policy. So I feel, how is it that, for example, Oliver North can be punished this way, and the Speaker of House walks away with an incredible retirement pay with 69 charges for unethical behavior, which he's not going to stick around to face, and as the Speaker of the House handled the Dear Comandante letter and undercut the President of the United States foreign policy, conducted his own foreign policy.
I'm no expert on Jim Wright. I do think that you may not have a lot of company out there in your clarion call. I mean, I think just this afternoon at the courthouse, Representative Dornan came to the courthouse with a petition signed by 58 or 59 members of Congress. However, he was a little deflated by the sentence. I think he was quite surprised, and he essentially said, well, I'll just hold my petition for now. Essentially, I think that interpretation said that this sentence of no jail time, no matter what the amount of money was or the hours, was definitely not what he expected, and it deflated his call for a pardon. So I don't know that you're out there with a big multitude right now calling for that. That's interesting.
Temple City, California, you're on the air.
Yeah, hello. I think that what he was just saying there about pardoning North is totally wrong. He should be sentenced to prison, and Bush and Reagan along with him. This is just making the cover-up complete if they pardon North.
Thank you, sir. Response?
Well, I don't think that there are very many people that share that point of view. The President of the United States is responsible for conducting policy to guarantee the security of these United States, and that's what he was trying to do. The Congress, in its majority, was opposed to that, and yet those responsibilities clearly are on President Reagan's shoulders. Now, one could argue that he should have kept on his fight, going more and more to the people to override Congress's objections. That's one of my criticisms. I think when President Reagan said, I'm not going to leave this crisis to another president, and he was talking about Nicaragua, I don't forgive him for leaving the crisis for President Bush. But to say that President Reagan or Oliver North or those are criminals when they're standing up for the security of this nation with their understanding of it. Now, I don't know what your understanding is of all the incredible intricacies of foreign policy and national security, but Oliver North understood them as a career military officer, and I think President Reagan did too.
I just think the story's not over yet, and we'll see what else comes out. I think there's still an independent prosecutor. They are still leveling perjury counts. They still have a grand jury in session looking at the people who testify before Congress. They just recently brought charges against Secord. There are a lot of unanswered questions, and this tale is by no means over.
Before we go to our next call, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our two guests. Sam Dickens with the American Security Council Foundation. As he mentioned, he had a military career. Spent 28 years in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel. His last assignment was as Director to Western Hemisphere Affairs of Plans and Policy for the U.S. Air Force. Also lived in Latin America for 14 years and served as a fighter pilot in Korea and Vietnam as a graduate of West Point. Tom Blanton with the National Security Archive co-authored for that organization the chronology, the documented day-by-day account of the secret military assistance to the Iran and to the Contras. He was a former journalist with the Atlanta Journal and Constitution and has also been published in the New York Times. He is a graduate of Harvard and was editor of the Harvard Crimson during his studies there. We go next. They tell us everything in these.
You're going
bios.
way back.
We go next to Florida for our call. Navarro Beach, you're on the air.
Hi, Susan.
Good evening,
Just
sir.
love your program.
Thank you.
I'm going to direct this all at Sam because I love that man. He's really fantastic. At least he's got the guts to sit up there and tell people of the United States what really Olive North is. I think it's a shame that they convicted Ollie in any way, shape, form, or fashion. I don't know the other boy over there. I heard he was a Harvard man, and I don't think he knows what he's talking about anyway. But
I appreciate it.
I hope Ollie's listening to this. I was retired and I found a little extra job, and it'll give me some income. And tell Olive I'll make sure that I put every penny of that income to him, and I'm behind him 100%. All Americans should be behind him. All Americans, real Americans. Thank you.
Thank you for the call. Either guest have a reaction to that caller?
Well, it's your fan club. You should.
Well, you can see where he stands without any question in his support for Oliver North. And I do think it's time to have the pardon now. Some people might argue there are other trials. But, you know, Oliver North is the one that's been through the trial. And it's time to pick up the wounded from the battlefield. He's been on the battlefield. He was on one that was very physical and on another form of battlefield, and it's pretty physical the way it's affecting him. And I think it's time for President Bush to pick up the wounded and bring him back.
I think it's very interesting the caller's point about the conviction, because he basically says Oliver North shouldn't have been convicted. I think it's interesting because the jury said Oliver North should be convicted of the 3 specific things that he admitted in the courtroom having done. He admitted his guilt, and
Yes.
they all dated from the time of the scandals coming out into public and the period of the cover-up of the scandal. And it's that sequence of events, the sort of overt action to cover up, and his admission of that, and his admission of trying to cover up the bribe from Secord. Those were the things he was convicted of. The larger counts, the counts before the scandal went public, those were things the jury said, that's the responsibility of the higher-ups. That's President Reagan, that's Poindexter, that's McFarland. And don't overlook McFarland's role in all this, because as a witness, he appears to have been very, very frustrating to the special prosecutor. He appears to be very, very frustrating to Judge Gassell, who at various times during his testimony interrupted him on the stand. What are you talking about? Speak straight. Come on, Mr. McFarland. And the fact that McFarland had struck a bargain and got a suspended sentence, I think, played very heavily in Gassell's notion. McFarland, after all, was one of the superiors. He did sign his name to those letters that Oliver North had drafted. And McFarland does bear responsibility. He did show the remorse and so forth, but I think neither Gassell nor the independent counsel were very satisfied with his performance. I think there's a little language about in the independent counsel's petition to the judge asking for a prison term for Oliver North, where he says, well, about Mr. McFarland, you know, at least he related the facts extensively, if not perfectly, which is an interesting comment.
San Antonio, Texas, you're on the air.
Yes. Good evening, Susan.
Good evening.
And guests. I'm a first-time caller.
Glad to hear from you.
For you.
As an ex-Army nurse, I served in 2 wars, and I don't feel that Oliver North should get anything. Congress passed a confusing law, the Bolton Amendments, and I feel that they would have better served our country if they'd paid attention to the saving and loans mess, which will cost more than the Vietnam War. Congress is a poor example in making foreign policy. And all they really think about is getting reelected most of the time. And they seem to be more concerned about China than they are about Nicaragua, which is right on our border.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the call. Appreciate it. Tom Blanton, why don't you start?
Just a quick response that Oliver North was not charged with violating the Bolton Amendment. He was charged with some very specific obstruction of justice, destruction of documents, aiding and abetting, lying to Congress, and accepting a gratuity. As a government official, you're not supposed to accept a gratuity. He took a security fence. It's interesting, I don't know if Mr. Dickens has been out to the House, but if I were, I guess, who was it, Abu Nidal, that the North said, I got the security fence to protect my family from Abu Nidal. If I was Abu Nidal, I could drive right through that in my, little Chevy Nova. It's not a very sturdy fence. It certainly wouldn't protect from terrorists or from any one of the truck bombs or car bombs, the traditional way that they blow up people. Instead, it does keep onlookers away from the house. It keeps the TV cameras away from the house. It's a nice security fence to provide a little bit of insulation to your family. There's not much protection against a terrorist who would blow up a Pan Am jetliner. I think that was somewhat disingenuous for anybody who's actually seen the fence. And his covering up the fact of having accepted it from Secord, I think, was what convinced the jury to hold him guilty on that count of accepting a bribe.
But the sad part, I think, really is that the focus on Oliver North is not the correct focus. The focus really should be on the Congress. This is why all these things developed. And the lady who's been a nurse, the call from San Antonio talking about the Bolin Amendment, focuses on the umbrella that brought about all the problems. And that Bolin Amendment was designed to hog-tie the administration and President Reagan so that he could not conduct his own foreign policy. And it's the separation of powers that really is the issue. And it's not being addressed. It's falling by the wayside. Of course, that's where I hold President Reagan responsible for not standing up and getting rid of the war, challenging the War Powers Act, challenging the Bolin Amendment. Because ever since Vietnam, that has been the difficulty that we've continued to face. And until that's addressed, that who is responsible for foreign policy, not the Congress, but the President of the United States, we're going to continue to have problems.
Those top national security people in the Reagan administration had a great discussion right on this point, I think, in June 1984. And as a result of the North trial, we have the minutes of that meeting. I've got them over off the set here. Be glad to give you a copy because they're really instructive, because it's President Reagan and Vice President Bush and Schultz and Weinberger and Casey and Meese and others. I guess Meese wasn't there because they talked about going to talk to the Attorney General who was then French Smith. And they have this discussion about they're looking at Congress about to cut off the funds to the Contras. And they're talking about how we've got to put together some funds from third countries. And even though McFarlane had already accepted several millions of dollars from the Saudis, or solicited that money, he didn't inform the larger group. The larger group's sort of pensively thinking about this. And George Schultz speaks up and he says, well, you know, Jim Baker, who was then the Chief of Staff, Jim Baker tells me that if we went around Congress like this, we went off and raised money from third countries when Congress has said no appropriated funds, why, that could be an impeachable offense. And Bill Casey jumps in there and says, no, 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 that's not right. I'm a lawyer too. Jim Baker's not the only lawyer around here. I know what I'm talking about. And really, it wouldn't be impeachable. And Schultz says, no, no, no. You got to understand, the Constitution says that only the Congress can appropriate money. All right? The executive can't do that. That's the difference between having a king and having a president. And then Casey and McFarlane and others demur, and they say, no, no, not really. And the end of the meeting, McFarlane essentially says, we've got to go off and talk to the Attorney General and get an opinion about whether this is legal. So the next day, and this memo is reprinted in the Iran-Contra Committee report, they go talk to William French Smith. Say, well, what would make it legal? Can we go talk to these third countries? And French Smith says, yeah, three requirements. One, you got to tell Congress if you raise money from third countries. And two, there can't be any direct U.S. money involved. And three, there can't be any promise, any quid pro quo, in other words. And if you do those three, then it's legal. Well, if you look at what happened, according to the documents in the North trial and according to Oliver North's own testimony, none of those three things were carried out that would have made it legal in the opinion of William French Smith. They never told Congress, not about the Saudis. There were direct expedited aid in Oliver North's own handwriting, signed off by Ronald Reagan in the memo of February of '85. You can see that they had that discussion. They talked about specifically that point. What was constitutional? What was separation of powers? What can we do? They concluded what was legal, and then they didn't abide by it.
We have another call. Only 5 minutes left in the program. Reno, Nevada.
Yes, I do agree with the gentleman that spoke before this one. President Roosevelt, during the Second World War, when Congress said there shall be no arms sent to help in the war in our allies, at the time it was England, what President Roosevelt had done was he had our boys fly secretively the airplanes to the border of the United States then I have films of where the Canadians came with horse and buggy and rode the planes over to Canada. Thereby, the president was trying to circumvent the law. And Ted Soros has said that he, under President Kennedy never consulted Congress during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a fact, and under the Constitution, he had the right to run foreign policy. So what happened with Colonel North is just a fact that Mr. Wright decided to go to Nicaragua and run the foreign policy, and he was an unethical man.
All right, thanks for the call. Reaction?
Well, I don't think that Oliver North is unethical. I think when it comes to unethical behavior, it squarely falls on the shoulders of some of the people in Congress. But you know, Franklin D. Roosevelt did another thing when you were talking about that was really significant, and it shows the courage that the president takes in defending his country and leading his country when he knows he has to defend it. He sent U.S. Navy pilots to train the Royal Air Force Command in flying the PY Catalina. I raise that now because everyone's talking about the Bismarck that's been discovered on the floor of the Atlantic off the coast of France. The pilot who saw the Bismarck was a co-pilot to a Royal Air Force, was a U.S. Navy pilot. This is before we entered World War II. It's before Pearl Harbor. The next Catalina that came on after that one to maintain the visual contact with the Bismarck also had a U.S. Navy officer flying it. And this is what a president did with courage. Now, you could say it was illegal at the time, but the president has a responsibility for defending this country and taking the proper action. He also has to take the hits. And I'm worried most right now that President Bush is worried about how Congress has affected President Reagan's administration because of the Iran-Contra affair, and is not showing the proper courage with respect to the Nicaraguan resistance, Nicaragua, Panama, and Noriega, and Fidel Castro in Cuba. Things are getting worse, and I can't see what this administration is doing to take care of the situation that's building daily.
Rockville, Maryland.
Hi, Mr. Dickens lives up to his name in the fictions that he paints about the aid to El Salvador, the private Republican donors who contribute to the Central American problem haven't been discussed. The fiction that Ollie North lives, poor Ollie North, out in Great Falls, Virginia, which is one of the most luxurious areas we live in this area. But I'd just like to say, if Ollie's doing 1,200 hours of community service in amongst the malnourished, tortured, poisoned children that he helped poison by assisting in the dope business in the United States, I wonder why conservatives aren't calling for the death penalty for Ollie North, because that's where they seem to put their faith in stopping this drug traffic.
Well, I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Oliver North was not involved in anything to do with drug trafficking or any cocaine movement or helping people that were. That's the figment of the imagination of the people that have wanted to attack, say, the Nicaraguan resistance. It's very clear from the reporting and analysis that's being done who has been involved in the cocaine trafficking. I've been following it for at least 10 years on a daily basis. And when you talk about Oliver North, my goodness, living where he lives, a lieutenant colonel doesn't get all that much pay. He isn't on flying status either, so he doesn't have that kind of augmented pay. It's very difficult for him to live where he lives. But to raise that as some sort of an issue when you don't even know what kind of mortgage payments he's had to pay or how he's getting along with his salary is really a canard.
I'd like to jump in just on that part of it. I thought that was probably the part of the prosecution at the trial that the independent counsel probably had the most fun with. And that was the magic tin box in Oliver North's closet with the $15,000. And that was the explanation for everything in terms of their ability to pay cash for a used car or whatever. They brought in used car salesmen to describe how North had come in with a certain amount of cash, wasn't quite enough, went away, came back the next day with the right amount of cash. You had his co-workers in the National Security Council describe how, up until 1985, Oliver North was always borrowing a dollar here or $2 there for cab fare or whatever, and all of a sudden, miraculously, in the summer of '85, this was their testimony. He didn't have any needs anymore.
I don't know
but
I don't know what your experience is on something like that, but I've known people that have been very wealthy, and when you're with them, they never have any money. And who needs to pay or pick up the lunch tab? as someone who doesn't have that money.
But Mr.
They
Dickens,
just don't
you
carry
wouldn't,
the
you
cash
wouldn't
around
take a
with them.
security fence. You wouldn't take a security fence.
Let's
from
go
Colonel
to
Seacole.
Atlanta, Georgia. 1 minute left, caller.
We got to hurry. Okay, a couple quick questions concerning
Couple.
the constitutionality of the Bolin Amendment. Let's suppose the question of constitutionality of the Bolin Amendment was determined before North, Poindexter, and Secord and Hakeem testified before Congress, and the courts determined that the Bolin Amendment is unconstitutional.
All right, we'll let it go there.
Let me,
We're almost out of time.
basically, they did their own legal opinion inside the National Security Council. It's instructive. It was the only one they got on the constitutionality of Bolin, whether it applied to the National Security Council. And the guy who did it, Bretton Skironi, had flunked the bar a couple of times. He was a fairly low-level lawyer. They never made it public. And essentially, Bretton Skironi concluded that, well, Bolin probably applied to the NSC, but even if it didn't, it applied to Oliver North's salary from the Marine Corps.
We're out of time, gentlemen. I'm going to say thanks to both of you for being here. Tom Blanton with the National Security Archive, Sam Dickens with the American Security Council Foundation, both in our studios here in Washington to give their reaction to the sentencing of Colonel Oliver North.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you.